Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to say happy Mother's Day. You know, all the mothers out there, past, present, future, and the fathers that play the role of mother whenever they don't have a mother, kind of like I do most of the time. Um, I'd like to say a special thank you to my mom. She always encouraged me to be who I am, and you know, I love her for that. And I'm glad to have had the opportunity to get to know her. I know some people don't. So, anyway, we got that. As far as recent events, the Order of the Trident Kindle or ebook, in fact, all ebook varieties, whether it be Kindle on Smashmouth and Nook, if I can figure out how to get that one to work. All of them will be going live tomorrow. Um, Price will be jumping to $3.99. So if you haven't already pre-ordered, today's the last day to get it for 99 cents. So I hope you enjoy it. I've read the book a couple times, and it reads very smooth. Probably one of the best books I've done thus far, despite how hard it was to write. Other than that, The Order of the Trident 1, which is the book we're doing the live reading on currently, that one was released in hardback this morning on barnesandnoble.com. So, if you prefer hardback over paperback, that one can be obtained from there, and I may start purchasing a couple for shows just for the few that prefer hardback. They are a little bit more expensive, but they're a little bit more costly to produce. So, working pretty steadily on Order of the Trident 3, which is subtitled Exodus. That one picks up where Book 2 left off, and it brings the story full circle, and that'll be the final book in the Order of the Trident trilogy. All of that's just a small part of the Elderland series as a whole. And that's not to say that I won't expand on the characters later on. I mean, all of the main characters, you don't get a whole lot of their backstory. You kind of get where they come from in younger ages. In Ravion and Demetrix's case, Gareth, on the other hand, you get him in an older age, but you don't really get much of his backstory prior to that point in time. So, I will be at a later date, once I get my core series developed, I plan to go in and do backstories for those characters. That's still in the works, but ideas are always popping into my head. In fact, it's kind of a weird deal. I get one idea out, and then new ones pop in. So, anyway, so Order of the Trident 3, I'm planning to get it finished writing by the end of this month. I'm going to have to push really hard because, frankly, I've been kind of lazy on this one. Just other stuff. I don't want to say it's a lack of motivation. Part of it seems to be that I want to see how fast I can write it. I've already got about 20,000 words done on it, which is better considering yesterday I only had 14,000 words. So in the past 2 days I've done about 6,000. And we're aiming for about 80,000, which that was the goal for Order of the Trident 1 and 2, and both of those. Order of the Trident 1 ended up being 92,000 words. Order of the Trident 2 ended up being 96,000 words. So we'll see where Book 3 ends up whenever I get it all written. We're aiming for a July release on it, but I haven't made anything official on that yet, so in the event that I am not fast enough to finish the book by the time I plan to finish it, I'll release the date later on. That kind of goes against what I like to preach. Set your deadline and hit it. And I'm going to do my best to do that, but I was smart that I didn't release anything stating of when in fact it would be out. So, and then other than that, I've got my blog post that'll be popping tomorrow. It's going to talk about my recent troubles with writing. I don't want to say they're troubles. I've been doing other stuff. Reading, catching up on TV shows because I don't have a whole lot of time for TV. So when I do watch, I tend to binge watch it. And I'll talk about some of the stuff that's going on, some of the tricks that I find to keep myself motivated, and other stuff like that. But let's get this chapter read, and then I am going to get back to work. I believe after this chapter, we'll only have one chapter left in this book. I may take a week or two off of doing the live reading. I haven't fully decided, but we may jump into book 2 next. And then, about the time that one gets finished, we may be able to do book 3. But we'll space it out a little bit. But anyway. Chapter 13, The Catacombs. Perryman stumbled through the unknown wilderness of Vale. The voices screamed at him, none standing above the others, all shouting together to prevent him from picking out a single voice in the garbled mess. "Would you all please shut up?" he screamed, grabbing a fistful of his long, unkempt hair. He looked around, gazing at the wonderful woodwork of the castle interior around him. Servants fluttered about, performing their daily task, ignoring his presence. The aging wizard stood in the middle of the large grassland. The grain stood to his waist. Tiny barbed hairs snagged his linen pants in the light breeze, ripping the seeds away from their stalk. "Excuse me, ma'am. Can you please inform your lord that Perryman Salazar is here to speak with him about the birds in the library?" The sapling stood just taller than him, swaying in the breeze. "Ma'am, I must insist," he declared. "Why are you ignoring me?" A dark cloud floated overhead, forming a bulbous shadow on the ground. He tensed, turning to see a dark form behind him. "At last you found me. But I must inform you, I will not go without a fight." Red energy crackled about his fingers. He flicked his hands toward the small shrubbery, launching his power at the unsuspecting foe. The brush exploded, ripping its roots from the ground. "Brianna, will you please go and shut my door, please?"
Okay, but where's my bag from my Harley Quinn?
It's probably in the laundry room.
Can you show me where?
It's either in the laundry room or in your room, and no, I'm doing my reading right now. So please shut my door. I'll be out there in a bit. That should teach you. Next time, make sure you know who you're dealing with. The aging wizard turned in search of the keep that he was in moments before. To his surprise, it was gone, replaced with the most unsavory of fields. Who would put a grassland in the middle of nowhere? Sighing heavily, he stumbled through the grass and weeds, unaware of where he was headed. An unseen force snagged his foot, sending him toppling over into the overgrown field. He glanced down at the meddlesome trap, seeing a golden mask lying at his feet. "You don't belong here. Why have you come all this way?" He snatched the mask up and got to his feet. The voices intensified, their ramble more chaotic than usual. He closed his eyes, trying to quiet them, but it didn't work. They just grew louder. Excitement filled his mind, but it wasn't his own. "Shut up!" The voices silenced, leaving him to his solitude. He turned the golden cover in his hand, inspecting the faded scratching along the sides. It had no straps or buckles of any kind, simply a golden, emotionless a face with eye holes. The nose and mouth were formed but held no expression. A single voice rang out, booming in his head. "Put it on." The insane wizard slowly placed the item against his face. Quicker than he could react, it shifted, forming itself to him. Perryman felt the insanity of his years in solitude wash away, leaving him whole again. For the briefest moment, he was himself. A brown leather duster formed around him, replacing his tattered, dull robes. A blue and red jester's cap with silver bells spouted from his tangled, unkempt hair. The mismatched tendrils danced around like serpents in search of something unseen. He stood, looking around the empty wilderness. That was a hell of a way to spend the last decade. With a chuckle, he snapped his fingers. The air around him began to swirl faster and faster until the wild plains were no longer in sight. An orange glow formed around him, engulfing everything he was. As quickly as he wished it, he was gone. Kane stood defiantly at the edge of Aldridge, staring at the map, calculating the distance from Hero's Gate. It wouldn't be long now, he thought, glancing back at his men, anxiously awaiting behind him. They shivered, standing in formation, whether from the cold autumn night or the nervous of the impending battle, he didn't know. Returning his attention to the northern road, he rolled the parchment and stuffed it back into his pouch. His greatsword stood in front of him, the tip several inches in the ground. He wrapped his hands around the pommel and lifted the blade, heaving it up to his shoulder. He squinted into the distance and took a deep breath. "To arms, men! We're under attack!" The Druafar filed out of the darkness, showing their numbers against the handful of soldiers. They had made it much closer than he had realized. "Form a wall! Keep the flanks open!" The soldiers squeezed together, locking their shields against the next. Several men stood behind the line, ready to thrust their spears into the approaching enemy. Standing several steps ahead of his soldiers, Cain searched the force, ready to impart his last orders before they would be upon them. "Beware the Druki. As a rule, they tend to be spellcasters. If we can kill it, we may break their resolve." His men shouted in confidence, taunting their attackers. The Druafar rushed forward, trampling the first few who weren't quick enough to stay ahead of the group. Readying himself, Cain let loose a mighty swipe, cutting the first three in half. Spinning around to keep them at a distance, he prepared to attack again. The Druafar swarmed, surrounding the lone warrior. The others washed around, slamming into the shield wall. Several fell to the spears, but they continued to pour forward. The soldiers planted their feet, holding their shields between themselves and the Druafar. Many took turns stabbing whatever weapons they had under the wall, hoping to fell as many as possible before the wall would have to drop. Several of the shieldmen fell, letting the enemy pass through the openings, but the others absorbed the fallen, closing the gaps before too many made it through, leaving the spearmen to deal with them. Cain spun around, letting the weight of his blade do the work. The Druafar were afraid to move on the young warrior, fear of being chopped down by his agile fighting style evident in their eyes. Mid-swing, he dropped his left hand, leaving his right to control the larger weapon. Grabbing hold of one of the clay flasks from his waist, he threw it as hard as he could towards the largest group of Druafar. Regaining control of his blade, he ducked down, shielding his eyes. The bright flash exploded, sending several of the Druafar into a panic. They rushed about, trying to escape the burning light, leaving nothing more than bone and ash to be carried away by the light breeze. Cain felt the ground shake beneath him. Looking up, he saw 8 muscular legs stomping toward him, each one hairy and thick like those of a tarantula. Lifting his sword, he prayed the fight would not be his last. Looking around, the Druafar still had him surrounded. The human soldiers held together, keeping the Druafar from entering the city. Several of the men laid dead around the wall, leaving less than 2 dozen to hold the line. The Druki stopped forward, flexing his thick legs with each step. It stopped just out of reach, extending his hands toward the armored warrior. Palms facing up, its twisted Druafar face glared at the lone warrior, hissing his vile tongue. "Rathel top paw pa." That was a pretty bad impersonation of what the hell they sound like. Fun fact, if you read these books, a lot of times you can decipher what the bad guys, or if the dialogue is spoken in a different language, a lot of times you can read it backwards and it will decipher what it says. For instance, this one says, "You'll pay for that." The creature flexed its arms, letting his muscles expand. It slowly squeezed his hands into fists, locking them around the unseen object. To Cain's surprise, he watched 2 short blades form in the creature's hands. It towered several feet over the warriors, smiling wickedly at the outmatched human. Rubbing his 2 summoned swords together, the seemingly hardened material crackled with energy. Swiftly, it lunged at him with one of the blades. Cain swung his sword in the fence, blocking the attack. It glanced off the steel greatsword, going wide. The Druki thrust in with the other, whipping his rear around to stab with his foot-long stinger. Cain dodged the second attack, but the third made him stumble backwards to avoid the deadly sting. The wall of Druafar would most likely run him through if he fell into their ranks. Realizing he had one option, he fell to his back. Timing the impact, he rolled, hoping he could get back to his feet in time. Seeing him prone, the creature jumped, landing on top of him. It tried to sting him several times, leaving a green ooze in the dirt with each stab. Cain kicked the oversized abdomen, launching himself a few inches at a time. It wasn't much, but it allowed him to avoid the deadly stings. Trying to maneuver his greatsword was impossible. The several legs of the creature and its size made the weapon a hindrance. Abandoning his sword, he pulled a dagger from his waistline. narrowly dodging the arm-sized stinger. He sliced quick and shallow, feeling the blade connect. It cut into one of the creature's legs. The creature hissed, moving to its other leg to compensate for the injured one. Kane rolled, slamming all of his weight into the injured leg. It collapsed from the impact, allowing him a small hole to escape. He squeezed through, crawling from beneath the beast, narrowly avoiding its crushing abdomen. Kicking hard, he let the momentum carry him to his feet. Watching the angered Jaruki headed for him once again, he grabbed the pommel of his short sword. Drawing the small blade from its scabbard, he adjusted his style to prepare for the incoming attack. The Jaruki locked its gaze on him. Another one of those other language things. I've had enough of this shit, this one says. It straightened its legs, thrusting the rear of its abdomen beneath, directed at the smaller warrior. A bulbous, hair-covered rear end convulsed, ejecting a stingy spray of green across the field. Kane jumped to the side, dodging the steady stream. Several Druifar screamed, feeling the acidic liquid eat into their flesh. The others stepped aside, hoping to avoid a similar fate. Kane glanced back at the screams, seeing the small group of Druifar meld into a chunky pool of black and green ooze. Great, it can spray acid at me. The other Druifar broke into cheer watching the spectacle. The soldiers were beginning to gain ground. Their flanks were horseshoed out, encompassing the attacking Druifar. Even the spectators were beginning to fall to the advancing protectors. Kane focused, knowing he would have to get much closer to injure the beast. The Jaruki hissed, angered by his miss. He stomped forward, ready to strike the human down. Kane waited for the creature to close in, counting its steps, timing the attack perfectly. The Jaruki sprang into action, aiming to cut the troublesome warrior in half. Knowing his failure would result in death, Kane lunged with the short blade, stabbing it deep into the Jaruki's chin. He brought the dagger up, slamming it into the side of the beast's head. The blades passed through easily, crisscrossing in its skull. The short sword shot out the top of its head, covered in black and pink ichor. The two summoned blades weakened before his eyes, dissipating into nothing. The unarmed hands scratched harmlessly against his polished yet dirty breastplate. "Meet one of the Jeruslayers," Kane whispered into the creature's destroyed ear. He watched it take its final breath, its eyes glowing dull with each passing moment. Ripping his weapons free, he spun around to face any of the attacking Druifar. The Druifar screamed in shock and panic, as if the order for a retreat had been given. The surviving Druifar scrambled to escape into the darkness. "Follow them! Cut them down before they can escape!" Kane heard the words escape his lips. "I'm spending too much time with Gareth," he thought. Knee-high brown grass danced on both sides of the dirt trail, swaying in the breeze. The bright green forest stood in the distance, with a mountain range to the east. The sun beamed down, causing beads of sweat to roll down his green skin. Crennan stomped along the countryside. The orcs living on the northeastern edge of Krondar were known to be difficult to deal with, but maybe with his bloodline he could get through to them in the coming days. Grace was not his specialty. He stomped as he walked, kicking up dust on the barren path. Crennan wore tan leather breeches with a red tabard and leather armor with multicolored scales of various browns and reds. In fact, if you want to see what that armor looks like, I'll show you real quick. That is the armor that Crennan wears. And then later on in the story, that's the armor Demetrix wears. I've also got Gareth's armor and a few others in the closet. Ravion's armor I haven't made. I've got the designs for it. I just haven't ever gotten around to it. Anyway. Where were we? Alright. The mighty half-orc carried a great sword with a row of throwing daggers across his chest and an axe hanging from each side. Crennan spotted the dusty pathway leading off the main road. Shifting his direction, he walked for nearly an hour, seeing the domed structures in the distance. Thank you, Nathan. Making his way closer, he recognized it for what it was. He'd found the elusive nomadic orcs of Krondar. He approached, feeling small under their glares of disapproval. He wasn't accepted here. no more than he was accepted outside of Marvain. But he had a job to do. It didn't matter if they liked him, they would hear what he had to say nonetheless. He approached one of the armored males. Looking up at his green face, he spoke in Orcish. "I need to speak with the clan chief." "The chief does not need to speak with you, puny half-breed," the orc retorted, measuring the smaller abomination. The orc stood nearly a foot taller, but had much less muscle despite his potency. "You're mistaken," Crinan corrected. "I've traveled here with the intent to speak with him." The larger orc backhanded him, nearly knocking him from his feet. Crinan caught himself against the side of the crude wooden hut. Reaching up, he wiped the liquid running from his lower lip. Inspecting his fingers, he looked at the blood clinging to them. He spat a mouthful into the dusty ground, feeling his rage build. Abandoning all reason, he charged the orc, hitting him in the gut. The large orc didn't have time to react, falling to the ground with the half-breed atop him. Crinan punched him several times, beating his face to a pulp. When he was done, he stood, looking at his blood-covered knuckles. The skin was split in several places, making it difficult to see how much of it was his blood. Several of the other orcs surrounded and pointed their spears at the half-breed, ready to strike him down. An old orc with braided gray hair approached the group. He pressed firmly against his walking stick, balancing himself with each step. "Let him pass." His voice was calm but commanding. He turned and slowly made his way back toward the large fur-covered hut. The orcs lowered their weapons, moving to give him access to the largest hut. Crinan passed between them, feeling their anger on his skin. He approached the large hut and lifted the fur-covered flap. Stepping inside, he looked around. The floor was lined with animal pelts. A large log was cut lengthwise and smoothed, making a bench large enough to sit 3 full-sized orcs. Excuse me. The aged orc had a long braided beard, matching the color to his equally lengthy hair. His dull green skin was beginning to wrinkle, but he looked as if he could still fight if required, despite his need for the cane. He gestured to the wooden bench, awaiting the half-orc to sit. Crinan plopped down, hearing it creak under the sudden weight. What brings a half-breed to the lands where he is considered an outcast? The elder orc grabbed a large gourd and pulled the cork wedged into the top. He placed it to his lips and took a long draw. "I was asked to speak with you in regard to the Druafar threat. They've escaped the underground and have already crippled Treasengal. If we don't band together, they're fully capable of overrunning Dalmora as a whole." The chief spat the liquid on the ground. "Dalmora, a name given by humans. It has no meaning here. Nor does your concern of the Druafar. Their concern of the Merkafar. As far as I'm concerned, let them wipe the filthy tree-huggers out. This threat is bigger than the rivalry of 2 races. If you don't heed my warning, they will be upon you soon. Your words have been noted. If they come here, we will deal with them. If not, they're not my concern." The aged orc sat calmly, replacing the cork and laying the gourd to rest. The flap of the hut opened, allowing daylight to drift into the large smoke-filled shelter. Chief, Calgar is dead." The newcomer glared at Crinan, his eyes full of hatred. The chief waved his hand in dismissal, watching the flap fall shut. "That is unfortunate news. He was one of the most able orcs of this clan. I'm afraid you'll have to pay for his death." Crinan looked from the chief to the door flap. "I apologize for his death, but I must return to inform my friends of your decision. That is no longer your concern. Calgar had a family. Without him, they'll have difficult times surviving the winter. The clan can help, but not nearly enough. You'll be taken north into Tolgrim. All of the clans interact there. You'll work to feed his family, and once you've served your time, you'll be released to continue down whatever path you so desire." Crinan felt the rage growing inside him once again. "I could crush his fell form with ease. Nobody could stop me from leaving then." The aged orc waved his hand, letting his energies flow. Crinan reached for his weapon, but it was too late. Several vines shot from the ground, wrapping tightly around his body. He struggled against the vines, reaching for his axe. The need for air was growing with the constricting bands. He fought to get free, fought to breathe, but the vines were too tight. Realizing he was doomed, his fight drained away and blackness overcame him. Mushrooms grew in patches, hunkered together in the cracks and crevices along the cave wall. They put off a soft glow in the underdark, illuminating the tunnels like tiny torches every so often. The floors and ceiling were rough, layered in thick mineral deposits. It was clear these passages hadn't seen visitors in quite some time, if ever. Naziel casually walked around the protruding stalagmites, their unique beauty lost upon him. He had one job, to free Azarel. Beauty was not a commodity he could beauty was a commodity he could no longer relish. He could feel the ancient energies calling to him. They were close, yet so far away. Feeling a change in their position, he froze, turning to study the jagged wall. He placed his hand against the cool stone, listening for their response. The growing fungus dimmed, the rubbery stalks flexing to avoid his touch. "I'm on the wrong damn level," he yelled. His anger boiled with the knowledge of so much lost time to find this specific tunnel, far below the unknown territories. Yet now it seemed he hadn't found the right one. "It matters not. I'll find it either way," he demanded, throwing his other hand against the wall, much like the first. The energy flowed from him, burning deep into the stone. He watched the layers meld together and start to recede, leaving a deep crater where he touched. The corners of his mouth tightened with success, forcing his will into the spell. He pushed further, allowing the magics to cut through earth, digging deeper and deeper, never seeming to stop. He felt like it had no end. Every time he started to feel exhausted, renewal washed over him. It was Azarel calling him home. It had to be. What else had the ability to rejuvenate a man such as he? His smile grew wider with each passing breath, reassuring him of victory. "You humans in Alfar don't stand a chance. Even if they rally against me, my army is too massive, restricted only by the hole we can crawl from. But with the constant mining, many more openings are being made every day. It won't be long before Shadwell falls and I claim the Dragonstone." The catacombs stretched further than ever before, and were days from breaching the surface right under their noses. His thoughts were interrupted with the last bit of rocks melting away, revealing a perfectly smooth tunnel angled deeper into the Underdark. He had trouble of seeing the distance, but there appeared to be some form of structure at the base. Naziel lowered his hands and stepped into the newly constructed tunnel. The walls were slick like glass. All traction burned away by his spell. He slid down the slide-like hole, careful to keep his footing. Reaching the bottom, he couldn't help but feel lost in the sight before him. There was so much... it wasn't so much the perceived beauty that caught his eye as much as it was the expert craftsmanship of the cathedral. Every inch of its towering presence was engraved and smoothed, removing any evidence of tooling. It was as if the strange black stone had been grown into its current shape and harvested to fit among the others. Even the fabled dwarves he'd read about didn't have that amount of skill. He stood in the shadow of the monumental underground complex, feeling his master's call from within. Naziel marched around the side, finding an ancient road set in the cavern floor. It was made of the same onyx stone, equally ornate and seamless, which seemed odd considering it was simply a road. What purpose did it serve other than to travel upon? Following the flawless pathway, he found the entrance to the antiquated structure. I seem to use a lot of big words that are hard to say. The doors were polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the loomy cavern behind him. A thick layer of dust had settled over the reflective surface, leaving a haze in the image. He approached the towering doors. They were much larger than required for any creature he'd ever heard of. But by this scale, even the eldest of dragons would have had plenty of room to enter. Not that a dragon would willingly come this far underground. He lifted his hand, facing the palm up at the sealed seams. To his surprise, he couldn't see himself in the dusty reflection. Like a lost toy, you don't realize it's not there until you're searching for it. Dismissing the notion, Naziel channeled his energies, letting it soak into the mysterious stone. To his surprise, it felt like the doors were absorbing his magic, pulling more than he desired to release. He tried to break the spell, but the doors continued to pull, draining everything he had. No! He couldn't let it take everything from him. He had to do something. His will focused into a single action. He siphoned off what power he could hide from the draining tether. Building it as quickly as he could, he released it into one massive burst, exploding out from him in all directions. Collapsing to his knees, he let out a sigh of relief, feeling the spell break. Panting heavily, nearly drained, he picked himself up. Magic's not going to work here. Well, shit. It looks like I'm just going to have to do this the hard way. And next section. Smoke rose from the center of camp, fading into the moonlit night. Several embers danced around the rolling wisps, turning to ash and floating off. 12 men sat in silence around the fire, staring into its hypnotic draw. Each was well dressed, less than a noble, but more than a peasant. It was clear these men held wealth, recently obtained, judging by their attire and trinkets. They held respect for one another, but played a silent rivalry, each one attempting to surpass the last, all the while not knowing where to start. From an outside perspective, they looked foolish, wearing their most expensive garments and effects to a private meeting in the woods. Leviathan watched from the shadows, sizing each one. They displayed their weaknesses proudly, unaware of their broadcast. It's time. He stepped from the shadows, revealing his presence. I'm glad to see you all made it. He marched to the center of the villainous group, placing his back to the fire. They were startled by his sudden arrival, unaware of how long he'd been watching them. Enough games. You called us here. Reveal your face so that we may look upon the man that has lined our coffers. A man with a tricorn hat and a thick woolen coat demanded with a laugh. Leviathan dropped his hood, revealing a bleached mask made of an orc skull. As you wish. His voice traveled from beneath the stone, moonlight reflecting the protruding cheekbones. They stared in confusion. Why would he drop his hood only to be hiding behind a mask? Whispers erupted among the group, growing in volume at a rapid pace. Silence! Leviathan demanded. You're all here for one reason and one reason only. The one thing you have in common. And what is that? A bearded, portly man asked, interrupting him. Leviathan moved with such speed the man was caught off guard. You all like to interrupt when someone much more powerful is speaking. He whispered to his dagger, lodged in the man's ear. Pulling the blade free, he wiped it on the man's shoulder and watched him collapse. And you all piss yourself when confronted with your demise. He continued, increasing his volume so they could all hear. Returning to his place near the fire, he started again, watching each one. Now, as I was saying, if there are no more interruptions. He paused, daring any of them to step forward. The band of brigands shook their heads, hoping to avoid the wrath of the disguised figure. You seek easily obtained wealth, but you're too stupid to obtain it by yourselves. You each hold command over lowlives, savages, scum, making your combined forces one to rival the armies you oppose. Prior to my arrival, you've been met with resistance from the Knights of Shadgul, but with my assistance, you've each warranted a great deal of wealth. Your men are happy, and you have enough gold to rival the lords you seek to steal from. He paced back and forth in front of the assembled leaders, lost in his words. The one thing I've asked in return is that you come when I call. He looked around the group, locking eyes on each man. And looking around, you have. It's time you repay your debt. The leaders followed him, hanging on each word. He wasn't wrong. Profits had dwindled for all of them prior to his arrival. If it wasn't Shadgul's nobles, it was a new band of protectors from Marvain, a group calling themselves the Border Wardens. They served the order of the Trident as protectors and bounty hunters for Dalmor as a whole. Fortunately, their numbers were still fairly small, preventing them from establishing a solid hold in the Highlands. But that would soon end if they didn't slow progression. Not to mention the constant shuffle of armies with the brewing war. Though it was easy to infiltrate the larger units and take what they needed. Leviathan pointed to the south, continuing his speech. In 2 days' time, the gong of Shadgul will sound. She'll be without her lord, she'll be without her knights, and she'll be without her army. Each of you will gather your men and impregnate the bitch. You'll have nothing other than a few guards to deal with. They'll be easily overcome by your numbers. Once you've entered the city, I don't care what you do. Rape, pillage, plunder, whatever it is your type enjoys, I don't care. What I do care about, however, is a very special emerald that's set in the center of King Rimley de Leon's throne. Retrieve this emerald, and I'll consider your debts paid. If you fail me, however, I'll slaughter you. I'll slaughter your families, and I'll slaughter your men. Am I understood? They nodded their agreement, fearing his unnatural speed and swift execution when questioned. "Oh, and one last thing. You have 3 hours from the sound to acquire my emerald. Any longer and you risk the return of Rimley and his band of asshats. I recommend you be gone before then." The fire flashed, blinding them for the briefest moment. Searching the opening, the cloaked tactician was gone, disappeared into the shadows. The unfamiliar walls were covered in a thick patchy moss. Glowing fungus clung to the crevices, displaying a variety of faint blues and yellows in the rocky passageway. The ceiling was moist. Thousands of droplets of water gathered, ready to fall to the floor below, leaving tiny bits of mineral behind to grow the jagged columns. Gareth cautiously walked along the natural formations. Chunks of blood and gore dripped from his shield, leaving a trail behind him. The glowing tunnel was eerily quiet, alerting him to the absence of his hated foe. He didn't recognize this passage, and from the unmolested walls around him, the Druafar didn't frequent this place either. Truth was, he only came this way because they were guarding it. Had they paid it no mind, he wouldn't have bothered. But there they were, so it had to hold value. He continued forward, spotting a change in design. The perfectly round hole laid against the otherwise jagged wall. He approached and inspected the unnatural find. It was a tunnel leading deeper into the Underdark. The stone was smooth, like it had been drilled away with the finest of precision. As far as his eyes could tell, it didn't dip or slant or curve in any other direction. It was simply a perfect hole leading straight into the unknown. Whatever they were guarding, I bet it's down here, he thought. He slung his shield across his back and stepped into the mouth. Subtlety was not his strong suit, but it was required for this endeavor. Checking the width of the tunnel, he pressed his shoulders and arms against the ceiling and walls. Content he could slow himself, he leaned back, allowing his hide-soled shoes to slip against the glass-like floor. Within minutes he reached the bottom, seeing an ancient structure carved into the underground mountain. He guessed it was a dwarven city. He'd never met a dwarf, but from the stories he heard, he thought he would get along with them quite nicely. He followed the walkway rounding the ancient complex. A large set of steps led to what he guessed was the entrance, a huge set of blackened stone doors standing open in the empty cavern. He stopped just outside the massive doors, dwarfing him by their size. Continuing onward, he stepped inside, lost in the imagery. The inside was amazing. Each stone was carved and molded to fit perfectly against the others, leaving no trace of a seam between each stone. Each one was made of the same material as the doors. Not a single pebble was out of place, revealing the magnificence of the craftsmanship. He saw no sign of dust or debris, a miracle in its own right, considering the age and size of the place. He found that thought troubling. Being this clean, that should mean it's occupied, but where are the residents? He questioned. Carefully, he walked down the dark stone stairway, keeping his eyes open for any movement. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end in the looming darkness. The solitude was almost worse than finding his enemy. He reached the bottom of the stairs, looking through the wide archway into the grand hall. He could see several pews resting in the center of the room, open in the center and along the sides. The far end held a domed chamber with a large altar at the center. Stepping into the cathedral, he walked along the bare floor between the pews. Their craftsmanship was exquisite, much like the structure itself. They were made from the same stone as everything else, but appeared mechanical, like they could shift form. He inspected them a bit closer, realizing a pattern to their design. 3 rows made a complete set. The first row was immovable, while the second converted into a table, and the third rotated the backrest to face the other direction. He found it interesting how such a simple design could change from a church into a dining hall in a matter of minutes. He looked around the large the large chamber. 6 towering figures stood along the side walls, like columns stretching into the ceiling. They were dressed in black armor, covering all but their faces. Nearly 20-foot-tall swords reached from their overlapped hands to the equally dark floor. He peered up at their faces, unable to discern what he was looking at. Each time the features settled, it would shift into another face, as if they were in constant fluctuation. He couldn't explain his reasoning, but he knew the 12 He knew the 12 figures were protectors, not just of him, but of this entire realm. Shaking the vastness of their purpose from his mind, he noticed the many thresholds along the wall between the column-like figures. All but one of their magnificent doors were sealed for an eternity, and that's where I'll find them, he thought. Gareth cautiously approached the open doorway. His hand was locked around his mace. The dark room was bare, save for an open passageway to his right. It looked as if the portal that was once hidden behind the stonework was now busted and scattered about the floor. He stepped through the rubble and into the opening. A single chamber lied beyond the partial hole in the floor. He could see the top few wedge-shaped stairs disappearing below. Quickly traversing the winding corridor, he paused, seeing a flicker of firelight. Drew don't require light to see. What's in there? He slowly stepped forward, peeking through the archway. A slender Druafar with long white hair stood in the center of the room, his back to the entrance. He was dressed in elegant robes made of royal blue with pearl-colored runes around the cuff and neckline. The figure stared into the large mirror, set in the far wall. Its function seemed misplaced in the large structure. Gareth couldn't help but notice it wasn't reflecting as it should. Where the contents of the room, Druafar included, should have shown. Instead, the inside of a crypt was displayed. His attention shifted back to the Druafar, searching him up and down. He noticed a saber strapped to his left hip, and a brown leather satchel hung from his right. There was something about this creature that was unsettling, something dark and dangerous, more so than his kind usually were. Gareth slowly made his way behind the beast, lifting his mace. If he could get close enough, he could strike it down without it knowing until it was too late. Naziel stared deeply into the ancient mirror, studying the magic surrounding it. He couldn't begin to understand the mysterious woven strands of energy. It was as if they didn't belong to any of the arcane schools, and from what he'd studied about divine magics, it didn't fit their mold either. This was something else entirely, something forgotten. A sweet scent drifted past his nostrils, a familiar flavor, coppery and dark. Druafar blood. His face contorted, stretching into a wicked smile across his lips. The commander of the fabled Drew Slayers has come to end my life. I must have done well to gain such an honor. He slowly turned to face his would-be attacker. Your kind has no honor, Gareth spat, preparing for battle. Mace at the ready, he charged the unarmed creature, rolling his shoulder. The slung shield slid off his back and down his arm. Flipping it around, he snatched the handle on the backside and locked it into place. Naziel casually waved his hand, letting the power flow from him. It erupted like a burst centered on him and exploded into the walls, disappearing from sight. Gareth felt the flood of energy wash over him. To his surprise, it didn't strike as he'd expected. He continued forward as best he could, slamming into the far wall. What the hell was that? Did he misfire? Never seen that happen before. He picked himself up, watching the last remnants of magic soak into the walls. Maybe this place, this stone, is warded against magic. Maybe that's why he couldn't cast. But that's more maybes than I like to work with. Best if I play it safe until I know for certain. This place is becoming increasingly annoying, Naziel calmly stated, his constant smile fading slightly. It seems you can't get it up. Don't worry, it happens to the best of 'em, you black-skinned bastard, Gareth taunted, letting his rage build. Kicking off the wall, he launched himself forward again, ready to deflect the explosion with the enchanted shield. He brought his mace down, aimed for the slender creature's head. Naziel reached out with unnatural speed and grabbed the head of the mace, halting the swing with his bare hand. I don't need magic to kill you. He forced the thick weapon back, letting the human's own weight do all the work. The blood-soaked handle slipped from Gareth's face and bashed him in the face. The blood-soaked handle slipped from Gareth's hand and bashed him in the face. I hope that's what I said the first time. It sounded different in my head. It was a solid enough blow to stop his advancement. He stumbled backward, shaking his senses back into place. Staring down at the onyx floor, he watched the thick droplets of bright red blood pour from him. All right, you want to play that way? Let's play. He spit the blood from his mouth, glaring his hatred at the creature. Tossing his shield and mace to the side, he drew his... there's a mistake there. He doesn't have his mace. Nazael took it from him. Nazael slowly slid his saber from its sheath, letting it drag against the leather wrap. Flipping it around in his hand, he dragged the tip across the stone floor and stabbed it down, letting it embed itself slightly. Releasing his sword, he opened his arms, inviting a clear shot. The curved blade wobbled back and forth from the pressure on the tip. He's challenging me, which means he's confident in his skill. He'll snatch his blade up and strike if I'm not ready. Gareth thought through his plan and charged. Swinging his right blade, he prepared to block with the left. Like a strike of lightning, Nazael shot out, snatching his sword up. Rolling his wrist, he easily sent the attack wide, continuing on his current trajectory. He stabbed inward, watching the second cutlass miss the block. The tip of the sword stabbed deep into the Drew Slayer's left shoulder. Gareth winced in pain, but refused to back away. Growling his irritation, he swung again, using the footwork to retract the blade from his shoulder. He swung wildly with his wounded arm, hoping it would distract his opponent. Redirecting his first attack, he struck with everything he had, hoping it was enough to get past the expert swordsman's defenses. Nazael knocked the Fane wide, and brought his sword across to parry. Using the blocked attack as leverage, he stabbed the tip of the sword into the already wounded shoulder once again, careful to keep from tearing the wound further. He took pleasure in the anger growing in his opponent's eyes. It gave him something to strive for. Perhaps once I've exhausted this man, I'll play with him for a... Perhaps once I exhaust this man, I'll play with him for a while. Of course, now is not the time. I have things to achieve while my armies are distracting the surface dwellers. Gareth's anger intensified with each miss. He sent a swing after swing at the Druidfar, hoping to break skin at least once. Nazael chuckled at the pathetic human's attempts. He's too slow, and his strikes are easily predictable. It's his rage that makes him such an easy opponent. How has he killed so many of us? Gareth turned red, his anger overflowing from the Druidfar's laughter. He sent barrage after barrage, but nothing connected. Nazael deflected the wild swipes. I'm done toying with you, he declared, bringing the saber around. The swing was quick and full of purpose. It caught the Drew Slayer just above his right eyebrow and sank down into the socket, stopping in his cheekbone. Gareth dropped his swords, grabbing his eye in pain. He couldn't see anything with it. The pain burned into his core. He felt it pumping through his body with each heartbeat, thundering inside him, like the rhythm of a drum. Staggering backward, he tripped, catching himself. He felt his knees impact the hard stone. His eyes closed, tears and blood running down his face. He sucked in the dusty air through his nose, trying to calm himself. Full of rage, he felt a coolness wash over him, soothing his pain. The bottled anger manifested into a power he'd never felt before. He saw the shadow approach him. Dropping his hands, he looked up to see the blurry figure standing over him, ready to end his life. Gareth gritted his teeth, his fist clenched, focusing his hatred on the creature. He wanted to strangle him, wanted to feel his body go limp beneath his grip. Nazael smiled at the defeated Drew Slayer. His eye was severed beyond repair. Even the strongest of magics had no chance at restoring it. A sense of satisfaction overcame him. It's time to end this. He approached the man, bringing his saber up to finish the job. Caught unaware, he felt a powerful grip wrap itself around his throat. Struggling against the unseen force, he searched for the energy. It clearly wasn't magic, though what else could it be? His smile faded, confidence turning to concern. His feet left the ground, dangling several inches in the air. It was becoming increasingly difficult to breathe. Gareth squeezed, hoping to strangle the evil creature. He felt his fingers wrap around the vermin's throat, though his fists were nowhere near him. Nazael knew he had to act fast or he would fail. His vision was beginning to fade from the crippling grip. Focusing his last bit of will into a single action, he let his power explode from him, sending it in all directions as it had once before. Pouring everything he had into the single blast, he inhaled deeply, feeling the air return to his lungs. Gareth felt the force of energy slam into him, breaking his concentration. He flew backwards, slamming into the wall. Something was wrong. He felt different. Like he'd eaten something bad. Only it was more than just illness. He felt as if something dark had crawled inside him, tainting his soul. He pressed his knuckles into the cold floor, pushing himself up. Movement caught his good eye. He glanced over at the mirror, seeing his reflection for the first time, though it wasn't a vision he recognized. A wounded Drew Afar stared back at him, one of his eyes missing and clotting. It had his facial structure and wore his clothes, but it wasn't him. It couldn't be him. Confusion and panic took hold. Gareth jumped up, charging at the imposter in the mirror. He tripped over the Druafar commander and slammed face first into the speculum. It reverberated, knocking him back. Naziel struggled to regain his breath. How the human had gotten past his defenses was a very serious question, one that would have to be answered. What was more concerning was how did he absorb the blast? He could see a piece of himself inside the frightened human, struggling for breath. He forced his words past his bruised throat. How's it feel to be one of us? Gareth heard the words. It couldn't be true. He'd never be one of them. He'd rather die. But the mirror confirmed his fears. Scrambling to his feet, he looked at the prone Druafar one last time. I'll never be one of you. He reached down and snatched up the loose satchel lying between the downed commander and himself. It wouldn't be long before the beast would be on its feet again, and he didn't have the strength to finish him now. Gareth ran for the stairs, hoping to escape with his life. Perhaps in the tunnels he could regain his composure, and hopefully find out what happened to him. And that is the end of that chapter. So, as I've stated already at the beginning of this thing, pre-order for Dammit Bree. Today's the last day at 99 cents. Tomorrow it goes up to $3.99 when it fully releases. Order the Trident 1 is now available on BarnesandNoble.com in hardback. Working on Order the Trident 3, Exodus, blog post posting tomorrow. And happy Mother's Day. I'm going to get off here and get back to work. Thank you guys. We'll see you next time.